Fantasy has a sound, or rather, a set of them. Musical cues which clue you in, evoking magic, heroes, villains, and a fantastical realm. And yet, fantasy media can be scored by anything from instrumentalists playing obscure woodwind instruments and hurdy-gurdies, to entire choirs belting vowels in harmony, even an entire studio orchestra. Surely there's no continuity here, no set of traditions which conspire to create the sounds of fantasy. All this music that we associate with the genre is just all a bit too disparate, right? Well, I believe that everything from chill tavern vibes to Howard Shore's Lord of the Rings soundtrack to Skyrim's main menu theme all exist within a web of influences that takes us straight back to the monks and bards of our world's history. So strap in and let's find the sound of fantasy. First, we need to acknowledge some broad trends true across much of fantasy media. There is a preference for real instruments, specifically those which have a tradition of historical use in Western music from the medieval period to the Renaissance. Things like harps, lutes, recorders, and pipes. This, and choral singing, are the main forms of diegetic music found in fantasy media. They exist as attempts to make music in the world, to evoke a kind of sense of old music, drawing from our expectations of historical music and folk music to create a sound that fits within the broad medievalism that is so common in fantasy. Heck, I'd argue that the style of choral singing used in fantasy, focusing on open vowels and often foreign or even invented languages, comes pretty directly from Gregorian chant as a musical tradition, a way to evoke the sacred and magical using the audio landscape of historical organised religion. Of course, none of this is universal. The soundtrack for the first season of The Witcher TV series makes excellent use of non-traditional fantasy elements in its music, specifically post-processed distortion and reverb, as well as solo-voiced pop-style performances, which sit in some interesting harmony alongside more traditional instruments, especially used in Slavic music. Especially the drone of the hurdy-gurdy, which bridges this divide between distortion and traditional music with its droning tone. This all conspires to create a really novel, distinctive sound. Sonia Belousova and Jonah Ostinelli do excellent work with this soundtrack, but it does feel like a fresh, new take on the sound of fantasy for a reason. The thing is, even when the music isn't diegetic, isn't being performed by a band or musician on screen, audiences' preferences for traditional folk instrumentation are very clear. So much so that Toss a Coin to Your Witcher is often critiqued for using a more modern pop song structure and composition. For some, the imposition of modern anachronisms feels jarring and detracts from the experience and the buy-in of fantasy. This in itself is a very clear sign that there is something here, there is a sound of fantasy that we are looking for, if breaking those rules creates such adverse reactions. So where does all this formalised expectation originate? And what the hell is up with the whole epic fantasy soundtrack with a full orchestra anyway? That's not exactly an evocation of medieval music. To answer all of this, I think we need to look at bards, specifically the traditions of epic poetry and the ballad. Both are historic forms of narrative storytelling set to music, but both influence the sound of fantasy differently. Honestly, the ballad as a form survives pretty well through the ages. It is a narrative told in verse through song and musical accompaniment, often with an intent to be danced to, remembered, and repeated. The ballad is a catchy encapsulation of a short, narrative theme. The kind of classic form of the ballad survives fairly well into the 20th century, even as a literary form, and it even moves into the modern day as a precursor to folk music generally, and as a term for a slow-tempo pop song telling us narrative about love or yearning or loss. But it is a more traditional form of the ballad that I feel is evoked by the often in-world, tavern-style fantasy music that we see. The expectation of traditional instruments, small bands, and the tavern-y setting. The use of the ballad seems to be fairly clear-cut. Frankly, the ballad is almost ideal for fantasy works. The epic poem, on the other hand, seems, honestly, at first glance, to contribute more to the meat and bones of fantasy plotting than anything particularly musical. Certainly not as an explanation for the brassy cinematic scores of fantasy films, games and shows over the last 50-odd years. But that's only if you're looking on the surface. In my view, epic poetry is a precursor to all epic film music ever made. And that's not just because they're both epic. I will tell you why I believe this after I actually expose my own foray into music making. I make videos about all things fantasy, but my bread and butter is world-building analysis of TTRPG style fantasy, which is why I was so intrigued when Homie and the Dude, TTRPG publishers, approached me about voicing a set of characters who exist without sight itself, who communicate through music, melody, tone, and even use a language based on Morse code. Sound is integral to the experience of fantasy, which is why I find the Scorched Basin such a refreshing project, because the sound of their setting is really important to them. And it's why I was convinced to lend my singing voice to some of their characters. I am one of over 100 creator collaborators who has helped build the sonic tapestry of this world. All 100% human created, filled with not just a plug-and-play setting, but in-world recipes inspired by the different tribes that you can cook yourself, because part of the book is a cookbook, with a setting inspired by both Dune and Mad Max. And to be entirely transparent, their Kickstarter also supports this channel to the tune of a 50-50 creator split on anything you may choose to buy, if you use my code in the description and pinned comment. So if this fantasy sounds up your street, please do check them out. But as for me, I've got a promise to keep. I've got to tell you how epic poetry leads to the soundtracks of fantasy media. Bards have been performing epic poetry as long as we've been telling and recording stories. They're long-form journeys of great heroes on great quests, often backed musically by the poet himself strumming a stringed instrument or something of the sort. The Epic of Gilgamesh, Beowulf, the Iliad, the Nibelungenlied, they're all examples of this form of epic poetry, with written versions of some of these dating back 1,000 or 2,000 years, and oral forms predating even those. It is an ancient and enduring genre that, as I hinted to earlier, gives rise to so many of the conventions of fantasy narrative. The Bard was, in effect, the custodian, distributor, and performer of the epic, which formed a huge part of storytelling culture well into the Middle Ages. Today, though, we're going to follow the Nibelungenlied specifically, because it is partly due to this specific tale that fantasy finds its sound. This dragon-slaying saga was really popular in medieval Germanic regions, but it was also very popular elsewhere across the Germanic and Nordic world, from even before the 10th century. Unlike ballads, though, Dark Ages epic poetry, like the Nibelungenlied, was very much out of fashion during the Renaissance, deemed inferior to the products of the ancients, especially in its comparison to the Iliad. Yet by the end of the 18th century, the Nibelungenlied begins to take shape as a symbol of Germanic culture broadly, especially among the German Romantic movement, which championed the Nibelungenlied as a national, homegrown epic. This background, alongside the very recent German unification, is the exact setting in which Wagner creates the Ring Cycle, a roughly 15-hour series of operas intended to be watched in sequence on separate days, which turns the story of the Nibelungenlied into the highest of culture. A massively ambitious project, which cribs not only from German versions of the tale, but also from Nordic precursors of the Nibelungenlied. Since it was an opera, music was a constant, mixing together dialogue with grand orchestration. In opera, specifically in this opera, epic fantasy is merged with music in totality. Wagner is clearly an inheritor of the classical and German romantic musical traditions, especially being heavily influenced by Beethoven in his orchestration. His work is certainly a product of its musical context, but especially his work on exploring and developing the concept of leitmotif to apply to each individual character as a narrative through line is often considered to be masterful and incredibly innovative. So surely a 15-hour total multi-part narrative experience which tells an epic heroic narrative with musical motifs for individual characters and themes at its core, with music driving forward and setting the tone, all composed by the same composer across the broader work. Surely this is the direct link to Lord of the Rings, scored entirely by Howard Shore, right? Well, not quite. Film music needed to develop into its own unique art form first. And ironically, it was while Hitler was appropriating Wagner's music to demonstrate a German supremacy that some of the greatest film composers of all time fled Austria and defined film scoring in Hollywood as we know it today. Max Steiner composes the 1933 score for King Kong, defining the tone of fantastical adventure films. And just 2 years later, Erich Wolfgang Korngold scored Captain Blood, which is the first on-screen appearance of Errol Flynn, and widely regarded as the film which repopularizes romantic costumed adventure films. You know, the fantasy of their day. He also writes the excellent score to The Adventures of Robin Hood. All of this music is massively influential. Captain Blood's orchestration is cited as directly responsible for the sound of Star Trek, for example. Korngold's biographer argues that he treated each film as an opera without singing, each character having his or her own leitmotif. It is the character and theme-based leitmotif that is the most enduring aspect of Steiner and Korngold's film scores, a technique whose most prominent previous advocate was Wagner himself, who needed recognisable musical themes to bring the audience along and remind them of the characters and the trajectory of their journeys through the narrative, through the massive narrative. And it is Steiner and Korngold's pioneering of this epic cinematic music that would later give the golden age of Hollywood its sound, seen very clearly in Lawrence of Arabia, scored by Maurice Jarre, and John Barry's music for the Bond films. Back in the world of literature, in the wake of the Second World War, the Inklings, a writers' group including Tolkien and Lewis, had decided that Shakespeare was too modern for literary study, and that one should really be studying the epics of old, like the Old English Beowulf and the Nibelungenlied. This, in turn, interestingly, leads both authors to pen fantastical works centred around magical rings. The Magician's Nephew and The Lord of the Rings, building on previous success in this burgeoning fantasy genre. The fantasy literary genre explodes, with bold new ideas alongside it, including theoretical analyses like Joseph Campbell's 1949 The Hero with 1,000 Faces, which codifies the hero's journey, based again in part on study of these ancient epic poems. Which brings us to George Lucas. He had a plan for a truly epic saga cribbing directly from Campbell. He envisioned a multi-film project, a serial science fantasy adventure story, perhaps inadvertently creating a massive Wagnerian cycle of his own. A set of standalone pieces connected by a larger quest, played over multiple hours, which necessitated cinematic reminders of themes, characters, and the quest. To boot, the filmic language of the leitmotif-driven, epic, orchestral score was firmly established through the golden age of Hollywood, and John Williams was brought on, eventually to score every main Star Wars film, with the job of, once more in a very Wagnerian sense, to create an enduring musical language of leitmotifs and quotes across the Star Wars universe. Fascinatingly, John Williams largely credits Korngold as chief inspiration for his compositional choices on Star Wars, not Wagner, indicating clearly that the musical language of epic film has developed into its own branch of sound. Also, as an aside, do listen to Korngold's title theme for King's Row, and you might hear some of this influence clear as day. Star Wars is truly this strange point of synthesis, where fantasy media and tropes meet the modern epic, scored by orchestral cinematic sounds that feel slightly retro in the 70s, while using Wagnerian leitmotif to support characterization and instantly generate drama. Of course, when tracing a path like this, it's never plain sailing. Music in the fantasy filmic genre doesn't continue in that Williams-esque orchestral style up until right now. Labyrinth and Highlander both spring to mind, with Bowie and Queen respectively providing modern rock accompaniments alongside more traditional film scores, for example. And that's just 1986. But I think it is fair to say that when Howard Shore sat down to write the score for The Lord of the Rings, the seminal fantasy text brought to live-action Hollywood cinema for the first time, his mind leapt to the legacy of epic cinematic music. From the Golden Age, through Korngold, Wagner, Beethoven, even through classical orchestral music, and found a continuous tradition of refinement. One which centred around striking leitmotifs, around character and theme, had a specific setup of a classic studio orchestra, the specific instruments that are used, the sounds that can be created, the use of music as a supporter and driver of narrative, and perhaps even the epic poetry which inspired Tolkien to even take up the pen in the first place. All told, watching the Lord of the Rings extended editions, you spend just over 11 hours, which is just shy of Wagner's Ring cycle, but they and their scoring are truly a monumental work nonetheless. They are the archetypal case of the synthesis of everything we've covered. In Bilbo's Birthday, you hear diegetic music featuring a tavern-style band. The Passing of the Elves sees vowel-heavy harmonic choral chant music sung in Sindarin. The Fellowship sets up broad, bold themes in its motifs which resound throughout the series, using that highly cinematic orchestral sound that has been perfected over the years. And all of this using traditional medieval and Renaissance instruments. It's all here, sitting alongside a narrative which fits it perfectly. The epics of old, indeed, once sung by the bards themselves. That is the sound of fantasy. I hope I've been able to draw together these musical and literary threads today into something that's not just convincing, but helps us dig deeper into the soundscapes of our favourite works, and gives context for the succession of influence and inspiration which sits behind all art across media and across multiple forms. And of course, even this video is in no way comprehensive. A study of this topic could fill a PhD thesis easily. And I did really want to get to power metal, but alas, this is all I can give you. And that, even with some very generous help from those far better informed than I. Please do consider checking out the Scorched Basins Kickstarter, which ends on October the 10th, using my referral link, which is in the description and pinned comment. But with all that said, and all that out the way, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon-Master. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.